Welcome to Inside Israel, everyone. I'm Joel Chasnoff, coming to you tonight from the Texas Hill Country, my last broadcast from the U.S. for a little while. I'm headed back to Israel later on this week. It is the week of January 8th, 2025. If you don't know me, I'm Joel Chasnoff. This is Inside Israel, where I really try to bring you the view from Israel, the way Israelis are seeing it. So, not just the headlines you're seeing on the web or in the news or wherever you get your information. But really, what are Israelis saying? How are we Israelis reacting to the news headlines that you are seeing everywhere else? I assure you, it's very different than the perspectives you're getting in traditional American, North American, or world media. So the idea is really to show you the Israel you didn't know, and to go behind the scenes. This is episode 64 of Inside Israel. If you want to see past episodes, you can listen to them on Apple or Spotify. Just put on Inside Israel with Joel Chasnoff. And before we get into tonight's broadcast, I do want to, first of all, acknowledge that for the first time in 64 weeks, we are not doing the live broadcast on Zoom. We're actually doing it on YouTube Live. So why are we doing it here? There's actually a couple of reasons. First of all, it's a way to reach a broader audience. You know, when you do the broadcast on Zoom, you're restricted to reaching the people who signed up for the link and who received the link ahead of time. When you do something like this on YouTube Live, anyone who's searching for something right now about Israel could put in keywords: Israel, current events, Israel news, etc. And they would happen upon this channel, this broadcast that's happening right now. So the number one reason is just it's a way to reach more people and to give them this kind of Israel perspective, even though they didn't sign up for the link ahead of time. The second reason that we're doing it here is logistically, it's just a lot easier in terms of taking the recording and uploading it to my website. I always make the recording of the live broadcast available on my website, which is joelchasnoff.com. I'll put that in the link later. And logistically, it's just easier to do that, cuts out a lot of steps and middleman, etc., by doing it here. So moving forward, it is my hope that we can keep on doing these on YouTube Live. Now, that said, I would love to hear feedback from you. You can put your feedback in the chat. Even better is to email me, again, just through the website, which is joelchasnoff.com. There's many places where you can hit a contact button and send me an email directly. I would love to hear what you think of this, how this format compares to Zoom. Already a couple of you wrote in the chat that you actually like it, which is great to hear. But I always welcome feedback. And in addition to like just what you would like to see in these broadcasts in general, I'm always, I'm doing this for you, and I'm always open to hearing your ideas as well. Another piece of front matter information: the episode that you are seeing right now is not going to drop on Apple and on Spotify this Wednesday. This Wednesday, Inside Israel on those platforms, Apple and Spotify, is going to be an interview. I've been doing a lot of interviews lately, and this one is with one of my favorite all-time Israelis, my very close friend, Benji Lovett. Benji is a comedian as well, originally from Dallas, Texas. He made Aliyah, I would say, about 17 years ago. And most importantly to me, Benji is my co-writer on Israel 201. We wrote that book together. It was an amazing, amazing project to pair up with him for. It was very Lennon-McCartney, although between you and me, honestly, it's like I'm John, Paul, and George, and he's Ringo. But we got it done, and I sat down with Benji a little bit ago and talked to him about life in Israel, life as an Oleh Hadash, as a new immigrant. We talked about El Al and everything El Al has been doing to us Israelis. So that conversation is going to happen on Wednesday. That's the episode that's going to drop. So even if you're enjoying this one tonight, you get another dose of Inside Israel on Wednesday when you listen to the podcast there. And speaking of Benji, I'm going to loop the idea of Benji back into this conversation later, because I want to share a little bit of news about him and his life that relates to everything that we are talking about here right now. Okay, so on to tonight's episode of Inside Israel, which again is called The Big Easy for you to say. And before I start with the meat of the episode, I do want to share a little bit of an inside story, which I think will relate to what I'm going to talk about. As I mentioned, I'm in Central Texas right now in what's known as Texas Hill Country. This is where I base myself when I'm not touring in the US. And last night, I went to the San Antonio Spurs basketball game. It was Spurs Nuggets, a great game. It was Wemby's 21st birthday, and Jokic was, of course, playing for Denver. So very excited to see this game. And at one point in the third quarter, the Spurs did this thing where during a timeout, they dropped candy bars from the rafters. They were attached to little parachutes sponsored by HEB. HEB is the major grocery store chain out here in Texas. So HEB sponsored a candy bar drop to the fans during the third quarter, during this timeout. And so floating down all over the arena were these candy bars attached to red parachutes. And in this arena of 20,000 people, you can guess what happened. 19,999 of them were laughing and cheering and screaming. And one guy, that would be me, was watching these parachutes come down with candy bars attached. And instead of enjoying himself with everyone else, he was thinking about aid and humanitarian aid going into Gaza. Because this has been one of the strategies of getting aid into Gaza is parachuting food into the Gaza Strip. And more specifically, I was thinking about the idea of multiple realities and how at any given moment, there are people, yes, all over the world, but let's focus on the Middle East. There are people in the Middle East who are living in drastically different realities than the ones that we happen to be experiencing right now in the US. I couldn't help but think that while all of us were in this arena, cheering, yelling, enjoying ourselves at this basketball game, that yes, there are upwards of 1 million people in Gaza who literally do not know where their next, I won't even say meal, but where their next bit of food is going to come from. And to be clear, I do not blame Israel for this. Israel has many times and in many ways tried to get humanitarian aid into Gaza. But as we should all know by now, it's rather obvious this aid is usually looted by Hamas or other criminal gangs. And so it doesn't reach the people who actually need it. But I'm going to go one step further right now, and I'm going to sound like a cold-hearted bastard when I say this. But I'll back myself up by saying that most Israelis actually agree with me. And what I'm going to say is that I am not deeply troubled by the lack of humanitarian aid that is reaching the Gaza people. And yes, I know that sounds awful. I sound like such an ass saying this. Worse, cold-hearted bastard. How could I not care about aid not reaching the people of Gaza? But like most Israelis, we can't wrap our heads around the idea that the world is worried about aid going into Gaza when there are still 60, maybe 70 living Israeli hostages being held in the Gaza Strip for now 450 plus days. It's unfathomable to us that anyone would even be talking about the importance of humanitarian aid when our own citizens are being held in the Gaza Strip. The way we are seeing this is the most unhumanitarian thing you could possibly do. Kidnap a child, a young woman, a young man, elderly, sick people, people with autism. Kidnap them and hold them in dungeons in Gaza and abuse them. More and more news is coming out about what has been done and is being done to our hostages. And I say our, meaning our people who are being held as hostages. Whether it's that they're being bound, kept in cages, that teens were forced to perform sexual acts on each other while their Hamas captives stood over them. You can look this up. This is in the news. The Times of Israel is doing great reporting on all of this. So to me, and I'm sure to many of you as well, it's simply unconscionable that we are even talking about humanitarian aid. And this is how so many of us Israelis see it. I I can't personally name a single Israeli that I know who is wringing their hands, worried about the people of Gaza who are not receiving the aid that they need to survive. Now, that doesn't mean that they are not out there. I've said many times on Inside Israel that I am in my own bubble, that each of us is, that we are in our own communities, and I'm speaking for the people that I hang with, that I talk with, and I talk to a lot of people, not just my circle of friends and family, but also sources and other journalists and people in the army. But I'm telling you, not once have I spoken to an Israeli who was deeply upset about aid going into Gaza. We all wish that the innocent people in Gaza, whoever they are and how many they are, would get the aid they need, but it's not a priority of us. It's not a priority for us. I won't lie to you there. And I'll take it even one step further. Many of us believe that it's even absurd that Israel was bringing aid into Gaza at all. The way a lot of us see it is that we should allow aid in once the hostages are released. You want aid for your civilians? Release our civilians. But the idea that Israel has been trucking food into Gaza, which we know is just going to help support Hamas, it's mind-blowing and inexcusable and unforgivable. So this whole, parachute drop of candy bars at the Spurs game last night, when you live in Israel, a cigar is never just a cigar. It's everything spurs an idea and everything leads you to think about something else. Now, related to this aid issue, there was a news story that came out this week, and I don't know if this got coverage in the US, but it certainly was covered in the Israeli media. We all remember the big, beautiful bear hug that President Biden gave to Bibi when Biden came to Israel. Well, it turns out that Biden threatened Bibi to not come to Israel. Biden actually said, I am not going to come to Israel. This is after October 7th, unless Bibi allowed humanitarian aid into Gaza. And that is the only reason that Bibi started allowing aid to go in, is that he wanted Biden to come over. But the original plan was to not allow aid into Gaza. And I remember in the days after October 7th, this was a known thing in Israel. There was no debate about whether or not aid would go in. The strategy being talked about in Israel after October 7th was, we are going to choke off Gaza. We are going to close the port. We are going to take over the tunnels from Egypt. We are going to block anything entering Gaza from Israel, and we will choke off the population, a siege, until the hostages are released. And this was the original plan until Biden actually said, I refuse to visit Israel unless you allow aid in. And Bibi agreed or crumbled or whatever verb you want to use. But that is the reason that aid ultimately was let into Gaza. Now, furthermore, there was a video released this week of the hostage named Liri Albag. Liri is one of the soldiers who was serving on October 7th, I believe, on the Re'im military base, who was then kidnapped. And there was a video released of her this week. And her family said that she's clearly not the same person, that her mental state is clearly deteriorated. And basically, her family, literally, the quote was something like, Bibi, you need to act now as if the hostages are your own children. It is time to let the hostage do whatever you can to get the hostages out. And so the idea of aid and all these debates about how much aid to be let in, when we see a video like this of this young woman, again, it doesn't even occur to us that we should be letting aid in. As far as we Israelis see it, the Israelis I'm speaking for, and I'm speaking for myself, there should be no aid until the hostages are released. Period. There's nothing negotiable here. I also want to add a little side note regarding this video of Liri Albag that was released. I personally did not watch this video. I have never watched a single one of the hostage videos that have been released. I haven't watched any footage from October 7th. Hamas had body cams, and all this footage is on Telegram and other places, even on YouTube, I believe. Very graphic footage. And I've sometimes wondered, should I be watching this? As someone who reports to you and who speaks to you, do I have a journalistic duty to watch this footage? I decided that I do not, and I'll tell you why. Number one, I don't think that the messages I'm bringing you and the insights I'm bringing you would be any different or would be at all improved were I to watch these videos. Number two, I'm still, on a personal level, I'm still dealing with a little bit of my own trauma from October 7th. And by no means do I want to say it's anything near on the level of what families of hostages have gone through, families of soldiers have been going through. Not even close. But as someone who lives in Israel, whose family is there right now, the way we're trying to process this and trying to live this dual life of, on the one hand, a normal life, but on the other hand, living knowing that our soldiers are still in Gaza and dying and that our hostages are still there. One of the things I just don't need to do is to see these videos. I just think it would hurt me in ways that I can't quite process yet. So when I speak of these videos, I want you to know that I'm not actually watching them personally, but I read what's in them and read the coverage and the reactions. And if you want to watch them, you may. I also feel, in a way, it's more respectful not to. But again, it doesn't change the news and the perspectives that I am bringing to you. I also want to add that there are U.S. citizens being held. That when we talk about these hostages, a number of them are citizens of the United States. And I don't think Americans have really registered this. I mean, wake up, America. Look what happens when you are held hostage by Hamas. Your government doesn't come after you. Your government does not try to rescue you. That bodes, that's a very bad sign. That bodes ill for the American people. That the American government, the American military has not done a single thing to try to get these American U.S. citizen hostages out, aside from making demands of Israel and making demands of Hamas, which we know Hamas is not going to listen to those. So, why was there not a special forces operation? Why not some sort of raid into Gaza from U.S. special forces, Navy SEALs, to try to rescue American citizens being held in Gaza? It's unforgivable. And I think it's very, very frightening as for Americans who live in America that your government is not going to rescue you. Your government is not going to go after you. And that very much ties into the title of tonight's episode, which is The Big Easy for You to Say. As you know, the Big Easy, that refers to New Orleans. And so the nucleus of tonight's episode is about the terrorist attack that happened this week in New Orleans. And I want to add that I'm adding a lot of things along the way. This is how I operate. But I want to add also that since this news broke, there was a Palestinian social media influencer who was arrested in Berlin for, I believe, shooting off fireworks into a public building and trying to set a building on fire. And this terrorist, as you all know by now, in New Orleans, who rammed the car into the crowd of people, two of whom were Israelis, by the way, who were injured. He was ISIS inspired. And there was an Islamic State flag found in his car. So how are Israelis reacting to this? Well, I got to tell you, when I heard the news that there was this terrorist attack in New Orleans and it was done by a jihadist, an Islamic State terrorist who believes in and carries out jihad, in many Israelis, thought the same thing. Finally, America will get it. Finally, Americans will look at this and see what Israel has been battling against for the past 15 months. Tomorrow is the 15th month, right? Anniversary of October 7th. And of course it didn't happen. It never does pan out that way. We Israelis always have this fantasy, and probably a lot of Jews around the world too, that we always have this fantasy that when God forbid something like this happens, and it's being done by an extreme Islamic terrorist. We think finally the world will see what Israel is fighting against and they will come over on our side and they will support us. And it never pans out that way. I think part of it is that America is a country where people move on pretty easily. And I don't mean to offend any of in our American audience out there right now, but I really do believe that America is very much a country that if it doesn't happen to me personally, then I'm not going to care all that much. That there's a limit to how much I care. And all you need to see as evidence for this is, what Memorial Day is in the US. Memorial Day in Israel is the saddest day on the calendar. Memorial Day in the US is picnics and barbecues and fireworks and half off mattresses at the mattress store, right? Sales. Because if it doesn't affect us personally, there's really a limit to how much Americans can care. And I know that sounds like an insult, and I'm not meaning it as such. I'm just telling you the way I see it. And so when these terrorist attacks happen and they happen at the hands of Islamic extremists, Israelis have this fantasy that Americans will understand finally, but it doesn't pan out that way. But I think there's a bigger question. And to me, the bigger question is, why are Israelis so obsessed with this idea? Why is it so important to us that finally the world will see what we're up against and finally they will understand what we're going through? It strikes me as such a Jewish point of view to want to be understood, to want to be loved by the majority. I think of when dignitaries come to visit Israel. The first place they go, they're always taken to Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Jerusalem, as if to say, look, this is why you need to support us. Look, see what happened to us. It's this idea that in Israel, we are still living in the victim mentality. And I've talked, for my book, Israel 201, I talked to one of the leading academics in Israel who studies the Israeli personality, and Tamar Katriel. And during her interview, she said, you need to understand, first and foremost, Israelis still have that victim mentality. And I personally think that this is unhealthy for us. We need to grow past this. We need to stop worrying about what the world thinks of us. And I know that's really easy for me to say, but what would that actually mean on the ground if we were to act like the rest of the world, like we don't care what the rest of the world thinks of us? Well, number one, I actually do think that we should cut off aid into Gaza unless the hostages are released. Or we should insist that UNIFIL, the United Nations military branch of the United Nations, should at least help be responsible for distributing the aid in Gaza, that we shouldn't be putting Israeli soldiers to fight Hamas and get in gun battles with Hamas as Hamas is looting the aid, or that U.S. troops, along with troops from other foreign militaries, also help Israel and UNIFIL to distribute the aid. But it should not be only on Israel to do this, because Hamas is not only Israel's enemy. And if it is only on Israel to do this, then we should cut off the aid. And we shouldn't care what the rest of the world thinks about our not allowing aid in. Number two, I think we need to destroy quickly as much of the remaining Hamas infrastructure as possible. The tunnels, the headquarters, even if it means that there are civilian casualties. And this is allowed according to the rules of war. There are rules of war, rules of engagement developed by the Geneva Convention. And the rules of war state that if you are using hospitals, schools, homes, other places where residents are being lived, where civilians reside, children reside and live, humanitarian zones, Hamas is attacking Israel from humanitarian zones right now. According to the rules of war, you are allowed to attack back. Now, Israel goes a step further, and we drop leaflets and we warn civilians that we're attacking those areas. But what I'm saying is that we should stop worrying about what the rest of the world thinks, because even when we drop these leaflets and give warnings, we are accused of genocide anyway, because the rest of the world doesn't know the rules of war and they don't care. Not when it's Jews, not when it's Israel. Number 3, we need to appoint an October 7th commission in Israel immediately. Now, what does this have to do with anything? Well, for a long time, the Israeli public has wanted there to be an official commission in Israel, government commission, to investigate October 7th, including how it happened and including IDF conduct in Gaza afterward. And so far, Netanyahu and his government have refused to have an October 7th commission. What does this have to do with anything else? Well, just today, there was a story about a young Israeli, an Israeli who was at the Nova Festival on October 7th, and he managed to escape. And then he served in Gaza with his army unit. And now he's out of the army and he's traveling in Brazil. And he was notified by the Israeli consulate in Brazil that he needed to leave the country as quickly as possible. He needed to get out of Brazil as quickly as he could. And the Israeli consulate actually helped him. How come? Because there was an arrest warrant put out by the Brazilian authorities for this Israeli for committing war crimes in Gaza. And one of the reasons that, and this is, by the way, the 12th case of this happening, of a young Israeli being somewhere in the world traveling, and the local authorities putting out an arrest warrant for this Israeli for war crimes committed in Gaza, just as an Israeli soldier who served in Gaza as part of his military service. And this is the 12th time that the Israeli consulate in that area had to rescue an Israeli and get that Israeli out of the country before he could be arrested. And one of the reasons this is happening is because there is no official Israeli October 7th commission. If Israel had its own commission saying, we are going to look into how October 7th happened, and we are going to investigate how the IDF behaved in Gaza ever since, that was one of the demands the United Nations made. And if Israel were to do this, it would be less pressure on these local countries to take matters into their own hand and arrest young Israelis who were serving in the army as IDF soldiers. But one of the major failures of the Netanyahu government, and I think there have been many, but one of the major ones is this complete ignorance of how Israel looks to the rest of the world. And I realize that sounds, on the one hand, backwards from everything I'm saying about not caring how the rest of the world thinks of us. But we have been completely ignorant of the message we are sending to the rest of the world. The messenger is the message. And in this case, Bibi has been a very poor messenger and a very poor representative of the Israeli case, the Israeli cause. And so everything we do is going to be interpreted in the most negative of terms as long as Bibi is in power. But I think appointing an October 7th commission would at least show the world that we care about what's happening in Gaza, whether we do or not, but it would send the message that we are, and it would absolve them of the need to arrest our young Israelis who are simply traveling after their army service. And number 4, the fourth thing I think we should do is I think we should finish the job in Gaza as quickly as we can, and then pull the troops out, pull all of the IDF out of Gaza, even if there's a little bit of some Hamas militants remaining, there always will be, in order to get the hostages out. The minute we know that we can actually get living hostages out of Gaza, we need to pull the IDF out. We have done enough to Hamas at this point that if they were to start with us again, we could go back in. But the clock is ticking for our hostages. It is well past midnight at this point. If we have any hope of them having any semblance of a recovery in a normal life or just getting out alive, we need to get our hostages out right now. But I think what ties all of these together is we need to close this chapter of Israel's history where we are obsessed with world support and the world finally coming around and agreeing with what we do. There are really only 2 things that matter when it comes to world opinion. Number 1, aid from the United States, that we have the munitions, the weapons, the bombs, the funding we need to fight our enemies, who are the United States' enemies as well. And number 2, The second thing that matters in terms of world opinion is the safety of Israelis wherever we are in the world. We cannot be in a situation where Israelis go on vacation in Italy or Brazil or what have you, and there are arrest warrants put out them for committing war crimes. And that has to do with how the Israeli government puts its face out to the rest of the world. I do believe that no matter what Israel does, those who hate Israel are going to continue to hate us. I don't think that anything we can do can actually change the haters' opinions. But I also think something else. I also think that when it comes to world opinion, that soon enough the rest of the world is going to find themselves, if not in the same boat as Israel, then perhaps a similar boat. What we saw in New Orleans this week, what we saw in Berlin with this Palestinian influencer being arrested for attempted arson, this is just the tip of the iceberg. I personally predict that over the next decade, the next 10 years, we are going to see a lot of extreme Islamic jihad style upheaval in Europe, in Australia, and in North America. And at that point, these countries will find out on their own what Israel is up against. They will not need us to say, see. They will find out and they will have to decide on their own how to fight these battles. And in fighting these battles, they will necessarily have to stop criticizing Israel. In fact, I think they will turn to Israel for advice. That's the irony here, is that we are fighting the fight ahead of time, and that I think these other countries, the US included, will be fighting it later on. And they'll be looking to us. And they'll also be now held to a very high standard that we have been holding ourselves to as we fight in Gaza, which I know might seem surprising to a lot of people, not you, but to others, that we've been holding ourselves to a standard. But we have been fighting this war with lower civilian casualties than the US experienced when they were fighting in Afghanistan, in Iraq. So, if anything, we're an example of how this kind of warfare in dense populated areas can and should be fought. I do want to mention really quickly the anti-Israel protest that took place on January 1st in Times Square. The day after the ball drop in Times Square, there was a big anti-Israel protest in Times Square saying that this is the year for intifada, for uprising. I mean, this wasn't about, freeing the poor Palestinians. This was really calling for Israel to be wiped off the map. And I should add that there were Jews there were rabbis taking part as well. I want you to pay attention to who these protesters are. Now, in general, as a person, I hate the word loser. I don't use the word loser. I tell my kids never to use the word loser because it's just it's an awful term. It's so insulting. But right now, I'm going to allude to it. The people at these anti-Israel protests are not the winners of society. They are not the CEOs. They are not the school principals. They are not the surgeons, the lawyers, the professionals. They are the interns. They are no offense to coffee makers, but they are the baristas. They are the ones who believe that they are owed something more and that they can become something bigger, but for some reason it just hasn't panned out for them. And they're actually falling way short of their own expectations for themselves. And they want someone to blame. And they blame America. And by proxy, they are blaming Israel. So we often call them the extreme left, but I think what we should call them are the extreme left outs because they feel left out from society and they want someone to blame. And what about the rabbis? Who are the rabbis who are protesting? Well, I know some of the rabbis who are protesting. And let me tell you, these are not the Abraham, Joshua, Heschels of their generation. They are not the Talmud scholars. They are not the awesome sermon deliverers. These are rabbis who are on the fringe as well. These are rabbis who have a hard time getting hired, who are on the fringe of not really having a job. And I know some of these rabbis personally. I've had conversations with them. Not one of them has blown my mind with their intelligence and insight into Judaism. And this also speaks to who is becoming rabbis nowadays. There's a big problem in the Jewish world. I think it's only I think we have under 10 students enrolled at the Jewish Theological Seminary right now. It might even be under 5. The Reform movement closed its Cincinnati campus. I mean, people are not becoming rabbis right now. And one of the reasons is us. We Jews we're difficult, and we've made it very hard for our rabbis. We expect them to be on call all the time. We expect them to lead the Jewish life that we not necessarily want to live ourselves. But you do have to ask who is becoming rabbis. And a lot of the people there are very few becoming rabbis, but the ones who are becoming rabbis are often ones who are on the fringe and really don't have another profession they can turn to. Now, there are some who are dedicated to Judaism and who love the idea of working with Jews and love Talmud study, etc. But for some, it's simply a place that will take them in, this sort of fringe population of Jews who they don't know where else to turn. And so these are the rabbis we're talking about at these protests and these rallies. But what it makes me think is that we've been paying a little too much attention to these protests and these protesters. We've been treating them as if they actually know what they're talking about, as if they're actually people worth respecting. And for the most part, they're people who are left out and who feel angry. And I think our attention has been like gasoline on the fire. I think it's time to stop paying attention to them. I really get the idea that a lot of America looks at them as ridiculous as well. And I think we just bring more attention to them, the more attention we put on them. In a minute, I'm going to take your questions, but first, I mentioned that I would bring Benji Lovett, my good friend, back into this conversation a bit. So, Benji, I encourage you to listen to our conversation this Wednesday on Apple and Spotify when I sit down and talk to Benji. But Benji just confided something in me the last couple of days that he's actually thinking of leaving Israel. He made Aliyah, like I said, 17 years ago, and he's now actually thinking of leaving Israel for good. And when I asked him why, he named a lot of the reasons that you could guess: the war, um, financial reasons. People's businesses have really been, if not hurt, then outright destroyed. And their incomes are lower. The feelings of frustration with the government, and also the social scene. It's very hard to be a new immigrant ever in Israel. As we mentioned in our book, Israel 201, more than 50% of immigrants from the US and Canada end up leaving Israel within 10 years. It's just so hard economically, socially. Israel is a very tight country, and Israelis are a very tight people looking out for one another. They have histories with each other, whether it's from school, from the army. I don't want to use the word cliquey, but tight knit in a great way. If you did not do the army, if you did not grow up in society, in Israeli society, and go to high school and college and have these essential Israeli experiences, it is hard to ever feel like a full Israeli. And I think Benji finally is experiencing that with, the war and the government making it all the more difficult. So it was hard for me. It was hard for me to hear. He's my closest friend in Israel, and I certainly hope he changes his mind. But as you listen to this interview on Wednesday, keep in mind that this is a guy who is considering leaving at some point. And by the way, one thing Benji told me is that when he shared this news with other Olim, with other immigrants to Israel, so many of them said, "Yes, we're thinking about it too." Now, Benji doesn't have kids, but he did say that a lot of the families who have kids, it's not just single people like him who are thinking of leaving, but also families with kids. And one of the things they mentioned is that they're worried about sending their own children to the army. Israelis grow up knowing they'll send their kids to the military. If you make Aliyah, if you move to Israel, this is one of the ideas you have to adapt to, is sending your kids to the army when they turn 18. And And a lot of the immigrant families who are thinking of leaving right now, from what Benji is telling me, it's because they're very wary of sending their kids to an army which we might have every reason to believe is going to keep on fighting these enemies for the foreseeable future. All right, on to your questions for this week. We had a number of questions come in, but looking at the time we have left, I'm going to take only 2 of them, and I'll save the rest for next time. So this one is from a good friend of mine. We actually went to dinner about a month ago in Fort Myers, Florida. Stuart, he's a big supporter of this podcast as well. Stuart writes, as you probably know, less than 20% of American Jews have ever been to Israel, even when things are good. So why would they go during wartime? And then he shared with me that he was recently at an outdoor Hanukkah candle lighting, and you could hear many of the Jews talking about their upcoming trips to Mexico or on a cruise or traveling to an all-inclusive resort in South America. And he said, it really disgusts me to hear them say this. It makes me sick. This isn't a question. I just had to vent. They have no concept of hineni, which means here I am. And I got to say, Stuart, I'm kind of with you on this at the risk of alienating some in my own audience right now. This is the time to stand with Israel and to be with Israel. By all means, take a vacation to Mexico, go on a cruise. But I think this is the time. People are always asking, how can I support Israel? What can I do? Coming to Israel, not just in order to spend money in Israel and help put money in the pockets of Israelis, but more than ever, Israelis appreciate tourists coming over to Israel. They are literally giving hugs to tourists and saying, thank you for coming. Thank you for keeping us in your hearts and minds and for not forgetting us. So I am with you. Now more than ever, it is the time for Jews to come to Israel. And I'll go one step further. In 20 years, how are we going to look back on this period of time? What are we going to say, not about Israelis, but what are we going to say about world Jewry, Jewry, Jewry? What are we going to say about world Jewry during the years late 2023, 2024, 2025? Are we going to say that they stepped up to the plate? What are we going to say about the rabbis during this period of time, that they did all they could to free Jewish hostages being held in dungeons in Gaza, or that they did a little bit but could have done more? I have a feeling we're going to look back and not just be really upset at the Israeli government during this period of time, but also look back and ask, wow, what were we Jews around the world doing? We should have done more. We didn't do enough. Second question, Sam from Boca Raton, Florida. 2 questions from Florida tonight. So Sam wrote in, I did a show in Boca a couple weeks ago. Sam wrote, it was great seeing you, Joel, at Chabad in Florida. I'm so glad we met. Crazy question. I used to spend my school summer breaks in Israel, and I usually got really homesick. I miss simple things like Major League Baseball, wrestling, ESPN, even my local supermarket. My question is, do you miss your life in the United States, or do you consider Israel home? Well, Sam, I'm in a very unique position to answer this question because I'm in the United States right now. I'm the last week of a 3-month comedy and book tour. And so I can answer that as someone who's in the U.S. The answer is yes and yes. I miss a lot about the United States. I mean, just going to like you said, a local grocery store where they have so much variety and the aisles are clean and it's cheap. There's only 3 families who import all of the food into Israel. So there's no competition. So they can set the prices as high as they want. We Israelis pay the equivalent of about $7 or $8 a gallon of gas. Living in a country where it's cheap and products are accessible, yeah, I miss that. And nodding to what you said about sports, I've never understood or gotten into Israeli sports. I don't understand the whole soccer thing, the whole where you move up or down a league. I never got into Maccabi Tel Aviv basketball. I tried. I can't. I miss Major League Baseball and the NBA. Do you know how much NFL football I have watched over these last 3 months? It's a sickening amount, Sam. So yeah, I miss that too. But also, yes, I do consider Israel home at this point. Um, of course, when the Houthis bomb us, and when I talk to my wife and she's in the bomb shelter at 4 o'clock in the morning, I think, what the hell are we doing? Why, when we don't have to live there, do we live? Do we live there? We could live anywhere else in the United States. Why do we live in Israel? Why are we putting up with this shit? But it is home. And there is something incredibly special about living there. There's something incredibly meaningful about living in Israel. That I mentioned this before, the tightness between Israelis. I did do the army. I often call the army the best worst decision I ever made because it was horrible and I cried pretty much every day. It was not fun. But looking back, there's no way I could live in Israel without having done the army. And I have great friends from it. And it made me realize what Israeli society is all about and who Israelis really are, and how once you get past that sort of gruff exterior of the prickles of the sabra, the cactus, there's a real sweet and generous inside. I do feel like easily at the end of the day, Israelis are the best people on earth. And so, yeah, it is home. Even though I went from a house to an apartment and from 2 cars to 1 car and a house with the basketball hoop to having to walk down the street to the local school to play basketball with my kid. Yeah, I definitely downgraded in some ways, but there is something very special about living there. And I also think it's really a great place to raise kids. I do want to asterisk that I have income. And Israel is a great place to live as long as you have enough money. It is a very hard place to live if you're struggling economically. So, again, I'm speaking for me in my own little bubble. But a third of Israeli kids live below the poverty line. So, what I'm telling you right now, my point of view, does not reflect what it is for every Israeli. But yes, in answer to your question, Sam, for me, it is, at least for the time being, still home. I want to thank you all for joining this week's episode of Inside Israel. I see the numbers are exactly what they are in terms of people who joined as they were on Zoom. So that means I didn't lose you guys. Next week, we are going to do this the same. We're going to do it on YouTube Live. Once again, please email me your feedback, your questions that I can answer, your comments, anything I can do better. I want to make this as good for you as possible. Next week, I'm going to be back in Israel. So we are going to go back to the Joel in Israel timeline. Do you remember what that is? It is 5 p.m. Eastern time, which is midnight for me in Israel. I used to do 4 a.m. in Israel to make it, 8 or 9 p.m. for you. I can't do it. My body at this age, sorry, can't take it. So we're going to go with 5 p.m. Eastern next Sunday. As always, the video recording of this will be up on my website tomorrow. And if you can't make the 5 p.m. Eastern next Sunday, it'll be on my website the next day. Listen to the episodes of the interviews I'm doing on Apple and on Spotify. And again, I'm going to put my website right here. If you have any questions, if you want the links to these YouTube lives, go to joelchasnoff.com. There's a podcast page and you can get all of the info there. For now, happy Gregorian New Year to all of you. I wish you a great week. I will see you next Sunday. And thanks so much for joining tonight's episode of Inside Israel. Lahitraot, everybody. Until next time.